I wonder if it wouldn't be very clarifying for you and I to make all of our major life decisions in a graveyard, a cemetery just like the one I'm standing in right now. Think about it with me for just a moment. All these beautiful headstones that surround me contain the mortal remains of people just like you and me that have now passed into eternity. Just like you and me, all of these people, once upon a time, they lived and they loved and they laughed and they walked and they worked and they reared their children, and then poof, one day they were gone and they passed into eternity. How clarifying would it be that every time we're making our major life decisions, we made it next to one of these headstones? Because our lives will ultimately become the culmination of all of our collective decisions along the way. And what if when we made those decisions, we had God's values in mind, biblical truth in mind, eternity in mind? What if? Come and join me as we continue our journey through 30 Days to Live. So our mortal remains will become nothing more than worm food. These mortal frames of ours, which, by the way, are fearfully and wonderfully made, but they will be nothing more than food for worms. The life we live, who we truly are, our soul, our spirit, that will pass into eternity. And if we've lived it in a way that greatly honors the Lord, and we've aligned our life with God's transforming truth in His Word, then we've created an enduring legacy. Stand to your feet with me, would you please? Let's read our series verse together. We are going to be reading Psalm 39, verses 4 and 5. We have done this each weekend now for 6 weekends. It reminds us of the fragile, brief nature of our lives, not to create fear. Certainly, I hope it's sobering, but to really focus us in on ultimate issues and what ultimately matters. Let's read it together. Are you ready? Begin. Lord, remind me how brief my time on earth will be. Remind me that my days are numbered, how fleeting my life is. My entire lifetime is just a moment to you. At best, each of us is but a breath. Say that last sentence one more time. At best, each of us is but a breath. And everyone said, go ahead and be seated, would you? I want to tell you that at the end of our Bible study this morning, we are going to invite everybody in the house that would like to come forward for prayer, because we want to lay hands on you and believe that this is the first weekend of the rest of your life to create a transformational godly legacy. Now, I want to tell you a story this weekend. Any of you like stories? Would you feel better if I got out milk and cookies and we had story time together? Okay? I want to tell you a story that is in reference to the ultimate long-term meaning of our lives. Let me say that again. It is a compelling biblical story about the ultimate long-term meaning of our lives. It answers the question, does my life matter? Say that with me, everybody. Does my life matter? And in a sense, does it even matter that we ever lived at all? I mean, certainly our lives have got to be of more significance and consequence than we simply are born, breathe a little, work a little, get married, have kids, grow old, and die and become worm food. That's not what the Bible teaches, and we're going to look at the alternative before us. Now, I want some of you to lift your sights this morning. Get your chin off your chest, because you walked in the house this weekend and you're feeling that you are living a very obscure life. You are living a life that's been forgotten, a life that's been overlooked. You feel that you are right now living a life that is pretty significantly unaccomplished. You are living a life right now that you feel is painfully average. And it's time for us to change our lens from our lens to a biblical lens. What do you say that in a very real sense we give God our lives in fresh surrender? This is a story of seemingly one of the most obscure people in the whole Bible. Her life was a life of tremendous adversity. I guarantee you she often wondered why God had even put her on this earth. And her name is Leah, Leah. Make note of that, and then buckle your seatbelt because we're going to go on a very compelling and entertaining and transformational journey. Leah's story is told in compelling detail in Genesis chapters 29 through 49. But her legacy plays out all the way through the last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation and heaven. So we begin with Leah in the first book of the Bible. That's where we're introduced to her. But her legacy, this obscure nobody from nowhere, her life is still making an eternal impact in the very last book of the Bible, 66 books later, and thousands of years in real time later. Okay, you say, how can an obscure person have that kind of an impact? Well, let's follow her story because it's very human and very normal. Her challenges in life began with her name. Leah, in Hebrew, means certainly weary or tired, but the most common understanding of what the word Leah means in Hebrew, its Hebrew root, is wild cow, okay? Not a name you want to give to one of your cherished daughters, wild cow. There goes old wild cow playing on the toys at the park. Her problems were further exacerbated because she had, unfortunately, a drop-dead gorgeous, darling little sister. Okay, you feeling the tension already? And this little sister had a name by the name of Rachel, and in Hebrew, that name means ewe, E-W-E, as in a female sheep. Now, when you contrast Leah, cow, to Rachel, female sheep, already we've got us a problem. It may suggest that Leah was not all that good looking. Furthermore, in Genesis 29:17, in comparing Leah's physical appearance to her little sister's physical appearance, the Bible says that Leah had weak eyes. This doesn't mean that she was probably nearsighted or farsighted. Remember, the Bible can never mean what the Bible never meant. We have to understand it in context. And to say that somebody has weak eyes from a Hebrew perspective very probably means that she had light-colored eyes, maybe green or a pale blue, instead of the Hebrew optimal, scintillating, smoldering eyes that all Hebrew women wanted, which were a very dark brown or straight black. So you've got this weak-eyed older sister of a cow up against this drop-dead gorgeous, darling, petite little female sheep, beautiful little Rachel with these dark, mesmerizing eyes. And the Bible goes on to say in that very same verse in Genesis 29, not only did Leah have weak eyes, but Rachel was lovely in form and beautiful. Now, that would be a hard thing to tell biblically because essentially women in the Bible wore a sack. They were not wearing form-fitting clothes that were spray painted on. They were essentially wearing an unattractive sack. And the reason they did that in a very arid, ancient Near Mideastern climate, it's hot. And when you wear loose-fitting garments, you're not only protecting yourself from the sun, but you're allowing air to circulate and refresh your body. So it's not just a fashion statement, but really it's about comfort. The only part of women that you really saw, certainly women that you were not related to in the Bible, was their eyes. Their body was covered with this sack. Their head was largely covered except for their eyes. And so that's why Leah, the weak-eyed one, is so significant early on, because that's how people knew her, because that's about all they saw of her. Now, as I set up this tension in the beginning pages of Leah's saga, some of you are already relating to it because you are going through life, and don't tell me you aren't, because you are. And I do it too because we're all humans together. We go through life secretly in our lives, competing and comparing ourselves up against almost everyone we meet. And often we arrive at the conclusion that we got the short end of the deal. We are constantly feeling that someone else is better, someone else is smarter, someone else is more beautiful or handsome, someone else has a more winsome personality, someone else has better behaved children or more accomplished children, someone else has a larger scope of ministry, someone else has a nicer house, enjoys greater favor, earns more money, has better health, sees greater results in everything they do in life. simply put, they are happier in life than me or you. And we play, because in a very real sense, we live in these 6 inches in our mind. And that's the lens by which we view ourselves, life, and the Word of God, and the God of the Word. Enter the protagonist in our story. His name was Jacob. Okay, Jacob's a very important person. His father was Isaac. His grandfather was the legendary Abraham. Jacob comes into the picture, and he falls wildly in love, of course, with who? The old weak-eyed cow, or the darling little scintillating-eyed beauty Rachel? Rachel, of course. And Leah is brokenhearted because her heart goes out to this man. She loves him in a sense, love at first sight. Now, Jacob had a character flaw, don't we all? He was a manipulator. Do you have any of those in your family? He was a schemer. He was a trickster. Do you have anybody you know that they tell you something, you're going, well, they're saying these words, but somehow that doesn't sound just right. I feel like they're not being fully truthful with me. That's who Jacob was. And when he met the father of these 2 sisters, Leah and Rachel, he met somebody that would outdo him in scheming. Somebody that was more of a trickster, huckster, and manipulator even than he was, because these girls' dad was named Laban. And so we have these 2 manipulators, Jacob and Laban, going toe-to-toe, and Laban is trying to get work out of Jacob, and Jacob is trying to get that beautiful daughter Rachel out of Laban. Do you see the story? Told you we're going to have story time today. Now, you need to know ancient Near Mideastern culture when it came to marriage. Whenever there was more than one daughter in the family, it simply did not happen that a younger daughter would marry before the older daughter. The older daughter had to be married first. I'm not going to go into all the reasons. Just trust me, it is so. That's the way it worked in ancient Hebrew culture. And so on the wedding night, although Jacob has worked 7 years by now for Laban, for Rachel, the love of his life, on the wedding night, the father, can you imagine what a creep this guy is? Laban switches daughters. And he gives Leah to Jacob instead of the beloved Rachel. Now, if you've had a wedding night, you know about all the anticipation and all the hopes and dreams and hormones and everything else going on in that night. Picture what it was like on that wedding night when the weak-eyed cow was substituted for the dark-eyed little sister beauty. First of all, they didn't have houses, they had tents. Second of all, they didn't have electricity. They had very sort of antiquated olive oil sort of lamps that were like 2 watts, right? So the tent had no electricity on this wedding night. Leah, furthermore, when she came in, as any bride would be on her wedding night, was heavily veiled. You couldn't see her face at all. It's already dark. And now she's got a whole rug over her head. You have no idea what you're getting, okay? He's just believing it's his love of his life, Rachel, coming into the tent. So they come together as husband and wife in the beauty of sexual and marital intimacy that night. And believe it or not, it wasn't until the next morning when the sun came out that Jacob discovered the switch had been made, because in Genesis 29:25, the Bible says, when morning came, there was Leah. I mean, can you imagine Jacob waking up, and he turns over to kiss his new bride, and oh my God, it's the weak-eyed cow. How'd you get in here? Or in Revised John version, Jeepers Creepers, where'd you get those peepers? Where is my wife? I mean, they've already been sexually intimate. He's in shock. So Jacob storms out of the tent, finds his manipulative father-in-law and said, you tricked me. By the way, step back, aside, notice this. God is not mocked. Whatsoever a person sows, that will they also reap. Tricksters will ultimately be tricked. Manipulators will ultimately be manipulated themselves. Liars will ultimately be lied to. It's the principle that God created of Mr. Kick and Mr. Kickback that we always get back in life what we give out and what we give away. Yes? Him who has an ear, let him hear. These two manipulative men, the son-in-law and father-in-law, are having this argument outside the tent. By the way, I bet you Leah's feeling really good about herself at this time, hearing this. Laban says, okay, you serve me another 7 years, and I will then give you Rachel as your second wife, but you have to finish out the wedding week first with Leah. And so they strike an agreement. Now, stop with me and think. Honestly, now let's be human beings, because these are human beings we're talking about. How do you think all of this made Leah feel? She is forced through custom to obey her father. She had given herself sexually to Jacob, and then she had to endure two terrible indignities. Number one, this man she loved, her husband, did not want her. He rejects her. Secondly, 1 week after the marriage, he takes up with her beautiful little younger sister, Rachel. There's a third indignity, and it's the fact that her father thinks so little of her and so devalues her, she is nothing more than a piece of property and a liability that he has to, through manipulation, download and get out of his life. So whatever problems you may have in your life, this morning when you came to church, you don't have these problems. This is the woman who will leave a godly legacy all the way into the book of Revelation. So just buckle your seatbelt and stay, because the story has not even begun to be told how it will play out. And you would be proud of me, because literally I could take 4 or 5 weekends and unpack this whole story. We're just hitting the peaks and the mountaintops. The Bible says in Genesis 29:30, that Jacob lay with Rachel also. Lay is a Hebrew euphemism for was sexually intimate with, and he loved Rachel more than Leah. Ladies, do you know when your dude is into you or not into you? Do you know when he truly is passionate about you and for you or not? You know that, don't you? You can't fool a woman's heart. And these sisters both knew. And it is setting up a very painful and awkward setting here in their lives. I see Leah at this point as a very hurt, very shamed, very depressed young woman crying alone in the corner of the tent, because she is dealing now with, in graphic, full color, arguably the hardest emotion we human beings can ever deal with. And you know what that is? Rejection. Those of you, and that's probably most of us, that have ever endured rejection, you know how hard it is to ever make friends with that, to understand it, to make peace with it, to get your arms around it, and to not go through life loathing yourself because you use that past episode of rejection as validation that indeed you're worthless. And this is what Leah is feeling. She's rejected by a father who cruelly manipulates her. She's rejected by the man that she loves, and she is in a very difficult place. Is life fair to Leah? No way, not even close. Because life isn't fair, and every one of us in this room are dealing with major curveballs in life, some version of, just like Leah is. And it's the lens through which we choose to interpret what happens to us that's the tale of the tape. So in my own journey, in May, when I got a shocking report from my doctor in the middle of the night that I had cancer, I began to have a talk with myself and said, okay, I've got one of two options here. I can lay down and die, even though I'm not physically dead yet, or I can say, this is the day the Lord has made. Let us rejoice and be glad in it. Whether I live or whether I die, I am the Lord's. I choose to live until he chooses to kill my mortal body, but then I'm going home to heaven anyhow. So either way, it's a win-win scenario. My friend Ken put this little, very meaningful cartoon on the door of my office at about that time. Show the picture, would you? And it's a turtle on his back. It's a bummer if you're a turtle and you're on your back. But rather than be all wigged because his life is upside down, the little dude is looking up, seeing the sky, and he, because he has a positive lens, can only think one thing. Oh my God, I'm flying. And that's how we need to approach life. This is not some psychobabble self-help. This is the Bible. This is the Bible I'm talking about here. The dude that God used to write half the New Testament, Paul, half of the books he wrote, he was in prison. He was a turtle on his back upside down. And he said, whether I live or whether I die, I am the Lord's. These present sufferings, Paul said, in no way compare to the glory that awaits me when I stand before the Lord on that day. You understand? So life's not fair for Leah, but it ain't over yet. Life goes on, and we've got these two competing, discontent sisters living in a tent together with one man. It's hard for me to explain to Americans how important having children is to the ancient Hebrew mind. It was more important than everything else we have in life. Our personal health, houses, lands, cars, timeshare condos, accolades, accomplishments, vocationally, career. None of that mattered. In fact, it all paled radically in comparison to the ancient Hebrew mind, to the value of being able to have your own children. There was not, obviously, in those days in vitro, adoption, all those kinds of things. If you could not have kids, it was affecting the very core of your existence. And what was that? Your inability to produce an enduring legacy. Life goes on, and Jacob is more sexually often with Rachel than Leah, and Rachel is infertile. She could not get pregnant. And so after a while, Jacob turns to Leah, and apparently Leah was fertile myrtle because she immediately gets pregnant and gives birth to a boy. His name is Reuben, which means behold a son. And in Genesis 29:32, she says, it is because the Lord has seen my misery. Surely my husband will love me now. Now, this is where I'm going to rapid speed teach, because I could go through the next, count them, 6 sons that Leah has, and Rachel's had none. And each one of the meanings of their names in Hebrew, she would be saying in essence, as she named her sons, she'd be saying in essence, surely my husband will love me now. I've given him yet another son. And it never worked. She craved the love of this man, and it never worked. And ultimately, by the end of her days, we find that Leah is ultimately only trying to please one, and it is the Lord. And that she does accomplish greatly. By the way, we all know that at this point, Jacob definitely does not love Leah. He can have sex with her, but he does not love her, which we all understand men can be that way. Have sex with somebody they do not love. So ladies, be mindful and be aware. That's why God talks about the covenant commitment of marriage as that binding, enduring commitment, which is a safeguard for the beauty of sexual intimacy. But that's another teaching. She has Reuben, she has Simeon, she has Levi, she has Judah, and it goes on and on. Now, this is where it gets zany. I mean, the most insane reality television show you've ever seen, this is worse. For those of you that think the Bible is not interesting, I don't know what Bible you're reading, because this stuff reads like a People magazine. It's hysterical stuff. So maybe the Bible is not boring. Maybe you're boring and you're not reading it right, because this is amazing stuff. When you could not have children in ancient days, what it was permissible for a woman to do, a legal wife, is to give her personal handmaiden or personal servant to her husband sexually. She would get pregnant, and then the baby born would actually be the legal child of this infertile mother. Okay, you following that? And that's exactly what's happening. Rachel is watching, infertile Rachel is watching all of this happening, and so she gives her personal maiden, Bilhah, to Jacob, and she gets pregnant. In fact, she has a couple boys, Dan and Naphtali. Leah, after having all these sons, is temporarily unable to get pregnant again. She gives her handmaiden to Jacob. The handmaiden's name is Zilpah. 2 more boys are born, Gad and Asher. You see what I mean about reality television? Now, you might be thinking, dude, this is good stuff for Jacob. He's having himself a good time. Well, not really, because there's a lot of quarreling and fighting and stuff being thrown and pots and pans and lamps, and that's not a peaceful tent. You know what I'm saying? There is a lot of angry women in the house. There's just a lot of estrogen going on. And so I bet you Jacob decided to go off and have some quiet days out in the back 40 just to get away from all the drama. It gets even worse that pretty soon the women are bartering over who gets to sleep with Jacob on a given night, and they're trading mandrakes with one another. Mandrakes, an ancient harvested, it's like a reed, and it can be used for a writing material. It can be used to make pottery, actually, household items and so forth. So they were negotiating. I mean, this is a house and home that is a fiasco. This is why, by the way, note to self, God says, just have yourself one wife. Just have yourself one husband. It's better that way. Okay, so that's what's going on now. By the time the kids are all born, we have 12 sons, 1 daughter named Dinah. You'll have to read about her story in Genesis. Very tragic story, actually. Rachel actually, at the end of her life, was able to have 2 children, Joseph and Benjamin. And in giving birth to Benjamin, Rachel dies and is buried. Now notice where she's buried. In Bethlehem, not in a grave. They didn't have graves in the Bible. They buried people in caves. You'd have family burial caves. If you're going to Israel and Greece with me in March, I will show you some of those burial caves. We will go into them, and I'll explain to you Hebrew burial custom, because that's how Jesus was buried after he died on the cross, and that was a cave in which he rose from the dead 3 days later. You may recognize the names of all of these sons by now, those of you that have some biblical literacy, as the 12 sons or the 12 tribes of Israel. You say, who's Israel? Jacob is Israel. His name was changed from Jacob the schemer, or he who grasps, to Prince of God, Israel. And these are the 12 sons of Israel, which became the 12 tribes of Israel, which became the foundational DNA pool for the whole nation of Israel to this day. Leah outlives Rachel. Leah, however, was not buried in a cave in Bethlehem like Rachel was. Leah was buried in the family burial cave at Machpelah, outside of Hebron. That is where Abraham and Sarah were buried. It is where Isaac and Rebekah were buried, and it was where Jacob would be buried with Leah. Okay? Jacob, Israel, buried with Leah, because at the end of his life, listen, it's not only significant that you have kids, it's significant where you're buried. And when Jacob chose the place that he would be buried, he did not choose by the side of Rachel in the Bethlehem cave. He chose to be in the family burial cave at Machpelah, just outside of Hebron, and lay there his mortal remains eternally by his wife, Leah, whom by now he loved. You might be looking at all this and saying, man, John, her life is incredibly unfair. She had so many things going against her. She didn't have her husband's love. She had this beautiful little sister. She had her father's rejection. She had all these things going on. But watch this. Leah's story teaches us that the eternal impact of our life cannot be measured within the few short decades of our life on this earth. Leah's story, like all of our lives, fits into the long-range tapestry of God's weaving in our lives. Here's the rest of the story as we begin to move to a wrap. What happened to all these sons of Leah? Leah's now buried and dead. Her mortal remains. She's gone home to heaven. She had a great priestly line from these sons. Her third son, Levi, was the line from which comes the legendary Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Without Leah, there is no Moses, there is no Levi, there is no first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Without Leah, there are no 10 commandments, there is no Exodus from Egypt, there is no prototype high priest upon which Jesus would model his ministry for us, and that's just the priestly line of Leah's godly legacy. And you're telling me her life did not matter, this weak-eyed cow? Leah had another descendant named Caleb, who you will remember had an extraordinarily optimistic spirit. He was the turtle on his back, looking up, seeing the sky, saying, "Oh my God, I'm flying." And it was only Caleb and Joshua that had confidence in God and trust in the God of their fathers to take the promised land as God foretold. She had another descendant by the name of Boaz, who was the great-grandfather of the legendary king of the whole Bible, King David. In that lineage from Judah, who was the third son of Leah, there was King David, there was King Solomon. Without Leah, we have no Judah. Without Judah, we have no Boaz. Without Boaz, we have no David or Solomon. Without David or Solomon, we do not have in our Bibles today the Psalms, the Proverbs, the Song of Songs, or Ecclesiastes. And those are just the priests and the kings. By the way, David was not the only king that came from Leah. There was also Asa and Jehoshaphat, Uzziah, Hezekiah, Josiah, and then prophets by the name of Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. There was Ezra, the legendary priest who restored Israel's spiritual passion for Yahweh. And there was Nehemiah from Leah, Nehemiah who was the great builder of the walls around the holy city of Jerusalem. We're in Christmas season, are we not? Did you know that Mary, Joseph, and Jesus all come from the son of Leah by the name of Judah? John the Baptist also came from Leah. In summary, without Leah, there is no Judah. Without Judah, there is no King David. Without King David, there is no Jesus. And without Jesus, we do not have salvation, my friends. And you're telling me the life of this weak-eyed cow did not matter? Who took care of, by the way, when Rachel died in childbirth? Who took care of Benjamin and Joseph when they were infants? If there was ever a time to get even against your nemesis in life, it's when she has 2 vulnerable infant sons. She is dead and gone, and now you can abuse these boys. Now you can take advantage of them. Now you can sell them off as slaves. How do you think these boys grew to a safe, confident adulthood and became significant players in the life of the nation? Leah's compassion. She evidently was able to get beyond her bitterness, and this woman who had a profound love for God in her heart did not judge Benjamin and Joseph for the sins of their mother. When we think of Leah's story, we've talked about priests and kings and prophets and spiritual leaders, and ultimately Messiah, Jesus, who came from her DNA. The truth of the matter is, you might feel this weekend that you're living a life of anonymity. So did Leah. She had no idea that her life would amount to a hill of beans. But what we do matters. And men, I want to particularly challenge the men in the house this weekend. What we do matters. It matters to God. It matters to our families. It matters to this church family. It matters to our community. It matters to generations to come, because our lives will echo in eternity. Decisions that we live out, deeds that we do or do not do, will long outlive us. Men, I'm asking you with all my heart to arise and be men of God, not dictators, not control freaks, not harsh or in any way punitive, but gentle, confident, strong, kind men with a steely resolve to serve the Lord and say, this is the way of the Lord. Walk in it. God is looking for men like that these days in 21st century America. We could change the spiritual climate of the Bay Area if the men who are men of God would arise in their full identity in Jesus Christ and be those kind of men. We could take this bay with the gospel of Jesus Christ if we would become those kind of men. And now the final end of the story. In Revelation 21, I told you Leah's legacy was enduring. We learn about heaven, which is, part of which is the heavenly Jerusalem. And in the heavenly city of Jerusalem, there will be 12 gates. And each gate will be made of a single giant pearl. You with me? Read it in the book of Revelation, chapter 21. Do you know how pearls are formed? The formation of a natural pearl begins when a foreign substance slips into the oyster between the mantle and the shell, and it irritates the oyster internally. It's kind of like the oyster gets a splinter, and life is full of splinters, isn't it? The oyster's natural reaction to that splinter, to that pain, to that irritant, is to cover up the irritant to protect itself, which is exactly what we humans do. We go fetal when pain happens. The mantle covers the irritant with layers of the same mother of pearl substance that is used to create the shell, and this eventually forms the pearl. Now back to the 12 gates into the heavenly city of Jerusalem. It's through these gates that we'll enter, each gate a giant pearl created through adversity. And Leah's own children, her own sons, will have their names on 8 of those gates. You and I may one day enter heaven through the gate of Reuben, or of Simeon, or of Levi, or of Judah, or of Issachar, or of Zebulun, or of Gad, or of Asher. See, Leah suffered much great irritation throughout her life that she did not ask for, did not want, and did not know what to do with when it arrived. But remember, out of great pain comes great pearls. That you and I are invincible and immortal until we have accomplished in this life all that God is asking us to do and become. Furthermore, what we will one day be, we are even now becoming. Never forget that. Don't say, one day I will walk with God. One day I will get my spiritual act together. One day I will get my spiritual house together. Today is that day. Now is the moment where we need to get our lives aligned with the Word of God and the God of the Word and say, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. It needs to be that kind of a holy resolve. This is my legacy. Would you put up the picture? There's the picture. Now, what you're seeing is my legacy. And this is a family filled with flaws and foibles and sins and imperfections, exactly like your family. This is just a family, but it's my family, and it's my legacy. And I have dreamed for my sons and daughters, 4 of these are Carrie and my children, too, are our son and daughter-in-law. Carrie and I have dreamed and worked our whole lives toward an enduring legacy, toward rearing sons and daughters that would not be self-important, entitled suburban brats, but would become world changers for the glory of God. And if you're going to have that approach with your sons and daughters, it informs the way that we parent. Too many parents are captive to their 8-year-olds. Get over it. They're 8, you're 42. Who's the boss around here? And I'm not talking in any way, any abuse, any violence, not even raising your voice. I'm simply saying lead your families well. And men, this is where we come into play again. It is not God's will that women should raise children alone. Now, I was reared by a single mother because of divorce. She eventually remarried. And that second marriage was no piece of heaven. Trust me, I lived through it. But there are many women that are married, that have a husband, that the husband leaves all the child rearing to the mommy. Don't do that, man. You made them. You raise them. You invest in them. You be a consistent presence in their life and coach their little league and be at PTA and discipline them when they need it and love them endlessly from sunup to sundown every day. And don't let difficulty or hardship or sickness or sinful decision or sorrow defeat you. Remember, the end of the story has not yet been told in our lives. Hold steady. Be men of God. Be women of God. And I keep this picture by where I have my morning Bible reading. And I keep it in our bathroom. And I look at it often because I'm saying, God, upon my sons and daughters, let the Spirit of Christ dwell. May my sons and daughters have hearts inclined toward God. And if ever they err, if ever they drift, may they be convicted and drawn back to thee. We need to be done. I got to preach 2 more times. Ask yourself, what will be my legacy?